In 1863, in the midst of our nation's great Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln spoke at the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
He was speaking of one of the most celebrated events ever to take place in American history. 87 years earlier, on July 4th, 1776, our founding fathers declared the American colonies free from British rule. They proclaimed their freedom by signing one of our nation's most important documents. We present to you now the Declaration of Independence. Great Britain had been settling colonies in America since 1607. By the early 1700s, there were 13 colonies under British rule. They were New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, Maryland, Delaware, Rhode Island, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. In 1754, the French and Indian War began in North America. It was waged between the armies of England and France. The war lasted 9 years, but with help from the American colonists, England was victorious and could now lay claim to Canada. Although they were triumphant, the war had proven quite costly to Britain, and they were now heavily in debt. The British Parliament proposed that a new source of revenue lay in taxing the people of the American colonies. Although no one knew it at the time, this was the beginning of the end for King George III's tyrannical rule in the colonies. In the early 1760s, a Massachusetts lawyer named James Otis gained prominence for arguing against court-issued writs of assistance. These were search warrants used by royal officials to thwart violators of the local customs laws. Otis and many others believed this to be an infringement of individual freedom and privacy. John Adams, a fellow patriot, stated that Otis' arguments before the Superior Court of the province was where American independence was born. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It was the first direct tax ever imposed on the American colonies. It was applied to newspapers, legal papers, and even playing cards. The colonists were denied a representative voice in Parliament and were outraged by the Stamp Act. They believed that taxation without representation was tyranny. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry spoke out on the stamp tax.
Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III...
Treason!
Henry's speech was interrupted when cries of treason broke out in the House. His reply?
If this be treason, make the most of it.
In protest of the tax, the colonists refused to buy British-made goods, and the colonies petitioned King George III to repeal the act. The new law became extremely difficult to enforce, so in 1766 the Stamp Act was repealed, but at the same time, the British Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. It gave Parliament the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts. It imposed taxes on glass, paper, and tea. Anti-British sentiment grew even more, especially in Boston, Massachusetts. In 1768, the House of Representatives of Massachusetts Bay sent out a circular letter which urged the other colonies to become united in their protest against the Townshend Acts. In retaliation, the British government ordered the royal governors to dissolve any assembly that approved the letter. The Virginia House of Burgesses was dissolved after they passed resolutions which declared that they, and not Parliament, had the right to levy taxes on the colony. The Townshend Acts, like the Stamp Act, proved unenforceable and was soon repealed. Parliament, however, left the tax on tea to show its authority over the colonies. 2 regiments of British soldiers were sent to Boston to quell anti-British sentiment in the colony. They were constantly met with jeers and disaffections from the Bostonians. On March 5, 1770, a crowd had formed around the customs house and began to taunt the lone sentry at his post. Feeling threatened, the redcoat called for assistance. 8 more soldiers arrived on the scene. Without being ordered, the soldiers fired into the crowd. When the gun smoke cleared, 5 colonists were dead. Word spread of the Boston Massacre throughout the colonies, and hatred for the British grew stronger. In June of 1772, the British customs vessel Gaspee was burned by Rhode Island colonists when it ran aground below Providence. That same year, Samuel Adams of Boston created a committee of correspondence to communicate with the other colonies. In 1773, the Virginia House of Burgesses, under the leadership of Thomas Jefferson, Richard Henry Lee, and Patrick Henry, did the same. In May of 1773, Parliament passed the British Tea Act. This gave a virtual monopoly to the British East India Company to sell their tea in the colonies. In November, the company's tea ships began to arrive in Boston's harbor, but the local dock workers refused to unload the cargo. The local British governor issued a deadline for the colonists to pay the tax on the tea. The date was set for December 16th at midnight. When December 16th arrived, Bostonians gathered at the Old South Church to discuss the issue at hand. It was agreed, too, that action and not words were needed for England to take notice. Under the cover of darkness, Bostonians, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded the tea ships and dumped every last chest of tea in Boston's harbor. The Boston Tea Party dealt a mighty blow to the authority of the British government. In retaliation, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, better known as the Intolerable Acts. Under this new law, the port of Boston was closed and Massachusetts was placed under military control. This in turn outraged the other colonies, and they rallied together to show their support for Massachusetts. In the fall of 1774, delegates from the colonies met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This gathering became known as the First Continental Congress. Peyton Randolph, Speaker of the Virginia House of Burgesses, was elected president. Charles Thompson of Philadelphia was chosen as secretary. Other notable members included John and Samuel Adams of Massachusetts and Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, and George Washington of Virginia. It was at this time that Thomas Jefferson published his pamphlet, A Summary View of the Rights of British America. In this pamphlet, he asserted that Parliament had no authority whatsoever over the colonies. The First Continental Congress condemned the Intolerable Acts, approved the arming of local militias, and agreed on boycotting all British goods. After being in session for 7 weeks, the Congress adjourned and agreed to redress any unresolved grievances the following spring. In March of 1775, a Virginia convention was held in Old St. John's Church in the city of Richmond. Believing that war with Britain was inevitable, Patrick Henry urged his fellow Virginians to take up arms.
Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death.
In April of 1775, British troops were sent to Massachusetts to destroy the arms and ammunition at Concord and capture Patriot leaders who were in Lexington. A silversmith named Paul Revere rode on horseback through the dead of night to warn his fellow colonists that the British were coming. On April 19th, British troops and volunteer militiamen exchanged gunfire at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. This was the beginning of the Revolutionary War, the War for American Independence. The following month, the Second Continental Congress convened at the Philadelphia State House. John Hancock of Massachusetts was elected president of the Congress. On June 15th, it elected George Washington to lead the Continental Army against the British forces. 2 days later, the Battle of Bunker Hill was fought north of Boston. Washington had yet to take command of the army, and the British were able to claim victory. The colonists, however, were encouraged by the bravery of the American troops and continued to fight for their freedom. Back at the State House, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia and John Dickinson of Pennsylvania were appointed to a committee to draw up a declaration on the necessity of taking up arms. The declaration, which was adopted by the Congress, stated that our forefathers, inhabitants of the island of Great Britain, left their native land to seek on these shores a residence for civil and religious freedom. In January of 1776, a 47-page pamphlet entitled Common Sense began to circulate among the colonies. Its author, Thomas Paine, had called for the immediate declaration of independence from Britain.
O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only the tyranny, but the tyrant, stand forth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England hath given her warning to depart. O receive the fugitive, and prepare in time an asylum for mankind.
By June, more than 100,000 copies had been sold. On April 12, 1776, North Carolina became the first colony to empower its delegates in Congress to vote for independence. In May, a convention in Virginia passed a resolution allowing their delegates in the Congress to vote for independence. They also proposed that Congress draft a Declaration of Independence for all the colonies to sign. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee presented this resolution to the Congress.
That these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, that it is expedient forthwith to take the most effective measures for forming foreign alliances, that a plan of consideration be prepared and transmitted to the respected colonies for their consideration and approbation.
John Adams seconded the motion, and the Congress began to debate the issue at hand. The colonies of South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and New York were still unsure about declaring independence from Britain. The delegates, believing that the vote must be unanimous, postponed it until July 1st. The Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft an official declaration. The members of this committee were Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York. The other members of the committee believed Jefferson to be the one best suited to draft such a historic document. Jefferson was reluctant to take on such a task. John Adams presented to Jefferson 3 reasons why he should.
Reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can.
So the reluctant Jefferson set out to compose the Declaration of Independence on a portable writing desk which he had designed himself. He labored for 2 weeks to create a document which would be, in his words, an expression of the American mind. He succeeded beyond anyone's expectations.
When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the cause which would impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form, as to them shall see most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object evinces, a design to reduce them under the absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
Jefferson then composed a list of grievances and abuses brought about under the rule of King George III. He concluded the declaration by stating,
We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
After Jefferson completed his rough draft, he presented the document to the other committee members for approval. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin made only minor changes to the declaration, and it was presented to the Continental Congress on June 28th for final approval. On July 1st, Richard Henry Lee's resolution was brought up again for discussion. By the following day, all of the colonies except New York voted in favor of independence. The delegation from New York had yet to receive authorization to vote on the matter. Their affirmation would reach the Congress on July 15th. With 12 of the 13 colonies in favor of independence from Britain, the resolution passed. John Adams believed that July 2nd would become the date on which we celebrate our independence. On July 3rd, discussion began on Jefferson's declaration. In his original draft, Jefferson had condemned the slave trade in America. Southerners, however, insisted that this be removed. The issue of slavery would not be resolved for another 100 years. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress ordered the Declaration of Independence to be authenticated. John Hancock, President of the Congress, and Secretary Charles Thompson signed it. Congress then ordered this historic document to be printed. Copies were sent to all 13 colonies. On July 8th, independence was proclaimed in Philadelphia. The following day, it was declared in New York, and the statue of King George III was torn down. Celebrations were held throughout America. After New York made approval of the Declaration unanimous, the Congress resolved that a final copy be officially inscribed on parchment with all of the delegates' signatures. On August 2nd, the official declaration was signed by John Hancock and 55 delegates of the newly proclaimed United States of America. Hancock's signature is by far the largest on the document. He wanted to make sure that King George could read it without the use of spectacles. On January 18, 1777, the Congress resolved that copies of this official declaration be sent to each of the 13 states. Although independence had been declared, America was still at war with Britain. The fighting would continue until 1781 with the British surrender at Yorktown, Virginia. The Revolutionary War officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris on September 3, 1783. The Declaration of Independence is currently on display at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Over 200 years old, it remains a shining example of our nation's idealism. When we read the words of Thomas Jefferson, we instill in ourselves the true meaning of freedom. When we celebrate the birth of our nation on the 4th of July, we celebrate life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all Americans.